Okay, well, it's the same song, but a different day. We're going to try to do a brief lecture on the cell cycle. So today's discussion is on the cell cycle. This leads to discussions in the future about cell division and how cancer develops in your body. But my focus is just looking at what the cell cycle is, why it's a necessary part of life and living system. What does it relate to? So what do we get as a result of studying the cell cycle? And then finally, who are the players? What type of things are involved in the cell cycle? So let's just start off with the what side of things. The cell cycle facilitates cell division. So it regulates and controls the process of cell division, and the purpose of having this organized cycle is to ensure that it is error-free, that we end up producing cells that are identical to the parent cell. The cell cycle occurs in order to facilitate the life of a cell. So cells have a limited shelf life. Some of your cells live as long as 2 or 3 days. Other cells in your body are living for the entirety of your life. They go from the time when that cell first formed and they continue to exist once they have developed. And we'll talk about types of cells that essentially live the duration or close to the duration of your life. So the cell cycle occurs in order to regulate the life of the cell. And really what it's doing is it's starting with a parent cell and then cloning that cell. And so it is, again, to ensure that we create a cell that is identical to the parent cell and is error-free. It turns out that the cell cycle is directly related to the ideas of growth and development. Growth and development, that is, going from the single-celled zygote stage to the adult form. So how do you go from one cell, the product of conception, all the way to a multicellular adult? And it also looks at how we actually kind of grow and how we develop different types of cells. And one of the words that is tightly linked to this discussion is the word differentiation. And that is, how do we get different types of cells? So the cell cycle is intertwined in that process of cells differentiating. Now when the cell cycle goes wrong, when it becomes corrupted, we end up with damaged cells, and those damaged cells often can become cancerous, which can then kill the organism. And the cell cycle is intimately related to how cancer develops. So in studying the cell cycle, we will also learn a little bit about cancer, and that we'll learn about in a few days. We're not going to focus on cancer today, other than when it might occur within the cell cycle. And finally, it's important for you to recognize the players of the cell cycle. And typically, the cycle we're going to talk about applies to eukaryotes. So that means the cell division model, or the model associated with the cell cycle, relates to animal cells, plant cells, fungal cells, and protist cells. The cell cycle that we're going to discuss here does not apply to prokaryotes. Prokaryotes undergo a process called binary fission, and we can talk about binary fission at a later date. But the sequence of events that I'm going to discuss with you really do not apply to prokaryotes. We are going to focus on the cell cycle of eukaryotes. So before we actually look at the cell cycle, I want to look at the question of why cells need to divide. And we can break this down into 4 major reasons, but there are others as well. And as I talk about the 4 major reasons, I'll probably hint at some other things. And so one of the primary reasons that cells divide is so that cells can reproduce. And here we could be talking about reproduction of an organism. And this might be an organism that is asexual or asexually reproducing. And this is the type of thing that protists can do pretty readily. So they can go from 1 individual to 2 individuals just by going through the entire cell cycle, going through a process called mitosis, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And in doing that, they can divide and make another individual. Some plants reproduce asexually. We call that vegetative reproduction. You might have experienced that if you've ever clipped a plant and then placed it in water and let it reroot. Well, you have now propagated that plant asexually, and in doing so, that plant has reproduced. There are many plant species that kind of grow asexually through runners. So strawberries are famous for doing this. They set out shoots and roots underground, and if the plant were to get severed somewhere underground, well, now you'd have 2 plants. So we can look at asexual reproduction in the cell cycle, and the process of this cell division is called mitosis. Mitosis is an asexual process. Now, we do not reproduce asexually, but our cells do. And so our cells are always in a continuous state of mitotic division within the cell cycle. So this is just normal cell division. Alternatively, the cell cycle can give rise to a process called meiosis. And here, this is about making sperm and egg. We'll talk about meiosis in a few weeks. Today, I am going to focus a little bit more on this topic of asexual cell division and mitosis, and shortly I'll give you kind of just a quick summary of mitosis before we jump into the cell cycle specifics. So why else do cells divide? Well, cells are the commodity of life. That is, we use cells and we dispose of them readily. And so a good example is your skin. Your skin is exposed to the external environment, and it's hammered by ultraviolet radiation, it's hammered by bacteria, it has chemicals that touch it, and the skin is protecting your insides. It's protecting living internal layers. And so about once every week to 10 days, you actually get a new coat of skin. Now, you're not a snake. You don't crawl out of your pre-existing coat and leave it behind. But every time you scratch your skin, or you put clothes on and off, or you shave, or you use soap, you are shedding skin cells. And those are dead cells. But they need to be replaced, and they're being replaced by the living cells that are growing underneath the dead cells. So this skin is a commodity. It's something that you use and you replace, and it protects your body. Another area in your body where cells grow fast is your hair. Another area where your cells grow fast is in your intestine. Your intestine basically sheds cells every single time you poop. So when feces is leaving your body, it's carrying a layer of you behind. So every time you flush the toilet, you can kind of wave to yourself and send your cells onto a new journey. These cells are in continuous recycle because the intestine is a pretty hostile place. It's the place in your body where the things you cannot digest exist. And so it's hanging out, and very often it's got toxins in there from the food you eat. I mean, some might refer to this kind of as a crappy place to exist, and so you can only accept so much of that bad chemical waste in your system. And so as a way to protect the rest of your body, you shed those cells. Now, there's a cost to shedding your intestinal cells every day. There's a cost to shedding your skin cells every week, and that is that those cells have to divide continuously. And the more times they divide, the greater the chance an error will occur. And fittingly, or interestingly, two of the most common cancers are colon cancer and skin cancer. And this is tightly linked to the number of times that those cells divide over an individual's lifetime. Another reason why cells divide is to repair and replace damaged cells. So your liver is responsible for removing toxins, and sometimes liver cells will die as a result of its activity, and those cells surrounding will divide and repair and replace those. If you've ever cut your skin, which I'm sure you all have, you'll note that those cuts eventually close up. Well, it's new cells that have come in and closed the gap, have divided as a result of the cell cycle to close the gap. And then finally, grow and develop. As you go from zygote to blastula to fetus to baby to toddler and so on, you are not getting bigger cells, you are accumulating more cells. And so those more cells accumulate as a result of cell division, which is regulated by the cell cycle. So what I'd like to do is I just want to introduce the primary mode of asexual cell division to you in eukaryotes and just say a few things about this. We call this asexual cell division, we call it mitosis. Mitosis happens in almost all cells. These body cells are called somatic cells. So these are the cells of your skin, your heart, your kidney, your muscles, your bones, your blood, and so on. It does not occur in gamete-producing cells. And these are your ovaries and testes. This area does a process called meiosis. But our focus right now is on mitosis. And mitosis is an asexual or cloning process. So let's focus on the cell cycle, and we'll look at its basic steps. Here is basically the cell cycle, and we're going to look at how a cell divides. And what you can see here is a chart, and if this is our original cell, that cell is going to go through a sequence of events, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'll name these events for you. You'll notice this long blue line that I just traversed. And so this process, which I am now illustrating in red and has the number 1 on it, is referred to as interphase. An interphase represents most of the cell's life. And this is when the cell is generally doing its job, whatever that might be. And then you'll notice that there is a tiny piece of the puzzle represented in yellow here, where that cell physically changes into 2 different cells. This process is called M phase. So the cell cycle is divided into these 2 larger processes: interphase, which is the majority of a cell's life, and M phase, which is the division part of its life. So here we are looking at the process of nuclear division and cytoplasm division. And this is called M phase. Now, when we look at the cell's life, we can see that most of it consists of interphase, and we're going to start with number 2. And number 2 is what we call gap 1 or G1, and this is a period of growth. So we start off here with a new cell. It has entered the world, and now it's going to begin to accumulate materials. It's going to eat, take in sugar, it's going to do respiration, it's going to do whatever that cell's function is. It's going to produce proteins. It will add new organelles. But the key is it's living its life. Now, some cells will continue from this first phase of G1, and they will skip out of the cell cycle and enter what we call G sub 0. And here, these cells are in a state of stasis. They are non-dividers. Can you think of any cells that basically do not divide? That was a purposeful pause to get you to think. And so these type of cells are things like heart muscle, skeletal muscle, nerve. So if you have a heart attack, you actually destroy those cells and they cannot be replaced. What is left behind is scar tissue. So those cells are out of the cell cycle, they're doing their job, and they're intended to live until you die. Your nerve cells, your brain cells are pretty much in G sub 0. They cannot be reset. This is why when somebody severs a spinal cord, the information no longer travels past the cut. That's because once those cells have died, you cannot replace those cells. They are out of the cell cycle. Cells that stay in the cell cycle are things like your skin cells, certain types of fat cells. Your liver cells can go into G sub 0, but then re-enter the cell cycle. So G sub 0 is a cell that is not dividing, but a cell that's in G1 sometimes will continue to move on. So when we talk about your skin cells and your intestinal cells, they are always in that cell cycle. A skin cell is going to go from G1, and it's not going to go into G sub 0. It's now going to go into a phase that we call S. And S stands for synthesis. And this is where DNA replication occurs. So we are going to copy the DNA so that the new cell has the appropriate genetic code. Once that DNA is copied, we enter G sub 2, which is growth 2 and prep for division. So here, the cell is going to accumulate more materials so that it can divide its contents between the two cells that are going to be the product of M phase. So again, we go from G sub 1, that cell is going to grow, it's going to do its function, into S. The cell is going to continue to function, but it's going to copy its DNA at this time, into G sub 2, where all the materials are going to be accumulated. The cell is going to check to make sure that it's capable of dividing, and then it's going to go into M phase, and in M phase we're going to have the division of the nucleus and the cytoplasm in order to make two cells. Next time we talk, we'll talk about what can go wrong in the cell cycle and look at how we get cancer. Well, that's it. I know that this was not 7 minutes. I did the best I could. Sorry. See you next time.